All right, ready to dive into a real brain twister.
Always up for a challenge. What have you got?
The prisoner's dilemma. It's like a classic thought experiment. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. It's all about game theory, right?
exactly. But today, we're going to look at it from a philosopher's point of view.
Interesting. So let out the math, more about the ethics of it all.
Exactly. We've got this great excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help guide us.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so picture this. You and your partner in crime, you get busted.
Oh, no.
Separate cells, no way to communicate. The cops come to each of you with a deal.
I've seen enough movies to know where this is going.
Right. Rat out your partner, confess to the crime, and maybe get a lighter sentence.
The classic snitch deal.
Or stay silent, hope your partner does the same, but risk a harsher punishment if they flip on you.
Yikes. So what's the best move?
That's the dilemma. It's like, individually, confessing seems like the safest bet no matter what your partner does.
Yeah, cover your own behind, right?
But if you both stay silent, you both actually get off easier than if you both confess.
So it's like screwing each other over even though you'd both be better off cooperating.
Exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out this isn't just some made-up scenario.
Really, where else does this kind of thing pop up?
Oh, all over the place. Economics, politics, even stuff like environmental issues.
I guess anytime people have to choose between doing what's best for themselves versus what's best for the group.
Right. Okay, so far so good. But this article, it doesn't stop there. It throws in some twists.
Like what?
What if the consequences are totally different for each of you? Like one person's facing a life sentence, the other one's looking at a few years. Does that change things?
That's a good question. The stakes are way higher for one person.
And the article actually has examples of this kind of thing, where the payoffs are lopsided.
Really? And what happens? Is it still rational to sell out your partner?
That's what's crazy. Even with those unequal stakes, that temptation to protect yourself can be overwhelming.
I guess it's the fear of getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah. Like, even when the stakes are super different, the fear of being the sucker outweighs the good stuff that could happen if you cooperate.
Makes you think, what if there's a way to just opt out entirely?
Right. Like walk away from the whole messed up situation.
Exactly. Does that third option change how people play the game?
The Stanford Encyclopedia seems to think it might actually make cooperation more likely.
Interesting. How so?
Well, if people can avoid those situations where they might get taken advantage of.
It kind of forces everyone to play nicer, right?
Yeah. Like a pressure to build systems where it's not just about screwing the other person over.
That's a cool idea. So opting out creates an environment where cooperation is more likely.
Right. And then they bring up this other idea, transparency. What if you could see what your partner was going to do before making your choice?
Ooh, now that would change things. Would that make people cooperate more?
It's tempting to think so, right? But the article says,
Hang on, even if I knew my partner was going to stay silent, there's still a chance I could betray them and get off scot-free.
exactly. And even if someone says they'll cooperate, it doesn't mean they actually will.
It's like, how much can you really trust anyone in this kind of situation?
It's almost like even with all the information, the prisoner's dilemma becomes this inner struggle. It's as much about what's going on in our heads as it is about the actual situation.
A little mind game on top of everything else. Okay, this is getting good. Where does the Stanford Encyclopedia take us next?
Well, things get really interesting when you introduce more players into the mix. Not just you and your partner, but a whole group.
Oh, wow. So like a whole gang gets arrested, not just two people.
Not necessarily crime, but think about it. Most real-world situations have way more than two people involved.
That's true. So how does that change things?
Well, imagine a situation where everyone wins if a certain number of people cooperate.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like contributing to a public fund or voting in an election.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
But for each person individually, it might seem smarter to just, be a free rider, hope everyone else contributes while you reap the benefits without doing anything.
Yeah, I admit I've been guilty of that kind of thinking. Like my one little vote won't make a difference.
Right. But of course, if everyone thinks that way, then nothing gets done.
Oh man, that's a good point. So it's like this huge collective action problem.
Exactly. Individual rationality clashing with what's best for the group. Again.
So we've got the basic two-person dilemma, we've added the unequal consequences thing, the what if I just walk away option, and now the whole group dynamic.
And the Standard Encyclopedia takes us even further.
Is there more? My head's already spinning.
Get ready, because they introduce us to something called the stag hunt.
The stag hunt. Okay, that sounds way more interesting than being stuck in a jail cell.
Right. So imagine this. You and some other hunters are trying to catch a stag.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Everyone needs to work together to bring it down.
Teamwork.
But each hunter could also decide to ditch the plan and just go after a hare instead.
So like a guaranteed smaller reward, but no risk of coming up empty-handed?
Exactly. Now, if everyone cooperates, they all get to feast on the stag.
Sounds delicious.
But if even one person goes for the hare, they get their hare, but those who stuck with the stag get nothing.
Oh man, that's rough. But it's still a dilemma, but with a twist.
Right. Cooperation can lead to the best outcome for everyone.
But there's always that risk, that someone will ruin it for everybody else.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia says this highlights how important trust is. It's not just about avoiding punishment anymore, but about believing everyone will pull their weight.
It's like having faith that everyone's in it for the long haul, that we're all after that big, juicy stag.
Yeah. And this brings a little hope into the picture, doesn't it? Cooperation becomes about striving for something better for everyone.
It's not just damage control, it's about aiming high.
But how do you actually build that kind of trust? When the temptation to go for the easy here is always there.
That's the real challenge. Luckily, the Stanford Encyclopedia has some ideas about that too. They talk about these things called asynchronous moves and trust games.
Ooh, those sound complicated.
Not really. It just means what if players don't make their decisions at the same time?
Okay, I'm following so far.
So instead of both choosing confess or stay silent simultaneously, one person goes first.
Okay, so the other person has to wait and see what they did before making their own choice.
Right. It becomes a game of trust. The first person has to decide, do they risk being vulnerable?
Hoping the other person will be cool and cooperate too.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia says this brings in a whole other level of psychology to the game. It's not just about numbers anymore. It's about reading people.
You have to try and figure out what they're going to do, maybe even send signals about your own intentions.
High stakes poker face. An article says this type of decision making, where it's not all happening at once, raises questions about fairness, about being vulnerable, and even how trust evolves.
It's like, how do we even learn to trust each other when there's always that risk of being backstabbed?
Right. And how do we build a system where people work together when the game itself seems to encourage suspicion?
Man, it's like the prisoner's dilemma is less about a specific situation and more about this basic human problem.
Totally. How to deal with other people in a world where everyone's trying to get ahead, but we also need to work together.
Exactly. So we've got the basic dilemma, the unequal stakes, the option of walking away, the question of knowing what the other person's going to do, and now the whole thing about how we learn to trust each other.
My brain is officially full.
And we're just getting started. But we'll have to save the rest of this conversation for next time.
Okay, I'm definitely going to need some time to process all of this. Until next time, then.
See you then.
So where were we? Oh, yeah, our brains were full from all this prisoner's dilemma stuff.
Right. But we're not done yet. The Stanford Encyclopedia still has a few more tricks up its sleeve.
Hit me with them. What else can we possibly add to this already complex scenario?
Okay, think about this. What happens if we play the prisoner's dilemma not just once, but over and over again?
So it's like a repeated game with the same players.
Exactly. It's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And when you introduce that element of repetition, it changes everything.
How so? What's the big difference?
Well, suddenly reputation and the whole idea of what if I need this person in the future comes into play.
Oh, I see. If I know I'm going to have to deal with someone again, I might think twice about betraying them.
Right. Because if you screwed them over now, they might screw you over later.
So it's like short-term gain versus long-term consequences.
Exactly. A strategy that seems smart in a one-off situation could backfire big time if you're playing the long game.
So does the Stanford Encyclopedia say anything about what kinds of strategies work best in this repeated scenario?
Oh, absolutely. And some of them are surprisingly simple.
Simple is good sometimes.
Like, there's this famous strategy called tit for tat.
Tit for tat. Sounds a bit childish.
I know, right? But it actually won several early prisoners' dilemma tournaments.
Seriously? Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the idea behind it?
It's basically this. You cooperate on the first round, and then you just mirror whatever your opponent did in the previous round.
Oh, so if they cooperated, I cooperate. If they backstab me, I backstab them.
Exactly. An eye for an eye.
I mean, it sounds kind of basic, but I can see how it would work. It rewards cooperation, but also punishes betrayal.
Exactly. Tit for tat promotes fairness and reciprocity.
But I'm guessing it's not perfect, right? Surely there are situations where other strategies might work better.
Oh, for sure. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy in the iterated prisoner's dilemma.
So what are some other options?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions one called Pavlov.
Pavlov, like the dog experiment guy. What does that have to do with the prisoner's dilemma?
Well, think about how Pavlov's dogs learned. They responded based on what happened before.
Right, the bell and the food. So this strategy, it also looks at past moves.
Exactly. It bases its next move on both the opponent's previous move and its own previous move.
So it's like if both players did the same thing in the previous round, it cooperates. But if they did different things, it defects.
Right. It's like a win-stay, lose-shift kind of approach. It's learning from experience and trying to adapt.
Interesting. It's almost like it's trying to figure out a pattern in the other player's behavior.
And then there are even more nuanced strategies like gradual tit for tat.
Gradual. So it's not as all or nothing as regular tit for tat.
Right. It's more forgiving. It starts with cooperation, But if the other player keeps defecting, it gradually increases the severity of its punishment.
So it's not like an immediate, you betrayed me, now I betray you. It's more like a warning system.
Exactly. It gives the other player a chance to get back on track with cooperation.
It's like, hey, I'm willing to work with you, but don't take advantage of my kindness.
That's a good way to put it. So as you can see, there's this whole spectrum of strategies in the iterated prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, from total cooperation to all-out betrayal with lots of shades in between.
And what works best really depends on the specific situation and who you're playing against.
There's no magic bullet. So how do you even choose a strategy then? It seems like you'd need a PhD in game theory just to get started.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually talks about how the prisoner's dilemma can be used to model evolution.
Evolution. Wait, what? How does Darwinian evolution fit into all of this?
Imagine a population of agents, each playing the iterated prisoner's dilemma against each other over and over again.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Lots of little digital creatures duking it out, strategically speaking.
Now, over time, the strategies that lead to higher payoffs, they become more common in the population.
So it's like survival of the fittest, but for strategies instead of organisms.
Exactly. The strategies themselves are evolving.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So are you saying that in this evolutionary prisoner's dilemma, cooperation actually emerges as a successful strategy?
That's what the research suggests. It's pretty remarkable. Even though it seems like defection should win out, evolution finds a way to make cooperation work.
I'm really curious about how that happens. Does the Stanford Encyclopedia offer any explanations for this?
They do. They talk about several mechanisms that can lead to the evolution of cooperation. One is the concept of spatial prisoner's dilemma.
Spatial prisoner's dilemma. That sounds like a mouthful.
It just means that players interact more often with their neighbors than with random individuals in the population.
So, like, if I'm surrounded by cooperators, I'm more likely to cooperate myself because that's what works best in my little community?
Precisely. It's almost like cooperation becomes contagious.
I like that. Contagious cooperation. We could use more of that in the world.
Right. And there are other mechanisms at play, too, like the possibility of players choosing to interact with partners based on past experience, or even the evolution of groups that cooperate within the group but defect against outsiders.
So it's like cooperation becomes a strategic advantage in a world where relationships and reputation matter.
Exactly. We're talking about spatial interactions, partner selection, group dynamics, all these things contributing to the emergence of cooperation.
It's like evolution is finding all these clever ways to get around the seeming conflict between self-interest and the common good.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia even talks about the role of communication.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about the moves themselves, but also about how players signal their intentions to each other.
Right. Even subtle signals can help establish trust and avoid those scenarios where everyone ends up worse off.
Makes sense. Communication can really help to bridge the gap between what's good for me and what's good for everyone.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that in some of these evolutionary models, things aren't static. The population doesn't just settle into a state of perfect cooperation.
So what happens instead? Do they all just start defecting again?
It's more dynamic than that. The population actually cycles between periods of cooperation and periods of defection. Different strategies rise and fall in popularity over time.
So it's like this ongoing dance between cooperation and betrayal. They're both constantly pushing and pulling on each other, trying to find a balance.
That's a great way to put it. And it really reflects what we see in the real world, too, doesn't it?
Totally. Societies are always struggling with that tension between self-interest and the common good. Sometimes we manage to cooperate, sometimes we fall back into old patterns of conflict and exploitation.
It's like the prisoner's dilemma captures something essential about the human condition. This struggle between our selfish impulses and our desire to connect and work together.
That's a pretty deep thought for a game about prisoners and snitching.
I know, right? But that's the power of the prisoner's dilemma. It seems so simple on the surface, but it has these profound implications for how we understand ourselves and how we organize society.
Well said. I'm really starting to appreciate the philosophical depth of all this. It's making me think about how we might actually use this knowledge to build a better world.
Exactly. But before we get too carried away with utopian visions, there's one more twist the Stanford Encyclopedia throws at us. And this one is a real doozy.
Oh no, not another twist. My brain is already overflowing.
I know, but trust me, this is a good one. Are you ready for it?
Okay, hit me with it. What's this final bombshell the Stanford Encyclopedia drops on us?
They introduce us to something called zero-determinant strategies.
Zero-determinant strategies. Okay, that sounds intriguing, but also kind of intimidating. What are they? They sound, powerful, like game changers.
That's putting it mildly. Basically, a zero-determinant strategy, or ZD strategy for short, it lets a player kind of control the other player's payoff.
Seriously, like no matter what the other player does.
Pretty much. It's like having a secret weapon that lets you dictate the terms of the game.
Okay, I'm officially mind blown. But how does that even work? Does the Stanford Encyclopedia give any
Oh
examples?
yeah, they talk about one called Set 2.
S2, catchy. What does it do?
With Set 2, you can basically force your opponent to receive a payoff of 2 no matter what strategy they're using.
So it's like I'm playing the game, making my choices, but no matter what I do, I'm going to get the same outcome.
Exactly. And the article says that this kind of power, it can be used to manipulate someone who's just trying to, maximize their own gains.
So it's like a form of exploitation.
In a way, yeah. The Set 2 player can offer their opponent a slightly higher payoff than the worst-case scenario, but only if the opponent does what the Set 2 player wants.
It's like, behave how I want you to, and I'll make sure you don't get the worst possible outcome. It's sneaky.
Right. And there are even more extreme CD strategies. They talk about one called Extort 2.
Extort 2. Okay, now they're just being blatant about it.
With the Extort 2, a player can consistently get a bigger share of the pie than their opponent, even if the opponent is trying to be cooperative.
So we've gone from dictator to extortionist. This is getting a little dark, isn't it?
Well, it definitely raises questions about fairness and whether it's truly rational to use these kinds of strategies, even if they give you an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, sure, you might win in the short term, but what about the long-term consequences?
Exactly. Especially if you're playing with someone repeatedly, building up a reputation as an extortionist might not be the best strategy.
No one wants to play with a bully. So does the Stanford Encyclopedia say anything about what happens when these ZD strategies go up against each other?
They do. And it turns out they don't do so well. If a ZD strategy becomes too common in a population, it starts to encounter other players using the same tactics.
And then what? Do they just cancel each other out?
Sort of. They tend to lead to lower payoffs for everyone involved, so their effectiveness is limited.
Ah, so it's like a self-correcting system. If everyone tries to be the dictator, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that there's this new research suggesting that certain types of ZD strategies, called generous ZD strategies, might actually be more successful over time.
Wait, generous ZD strategies? How can something be both generous and manipulative at the same time?
I know, it's a weird concept. But essentially, a generous ZD strategy lets the opponent get a higher payoff than a traditional extortionary strategy.
So it's like a kinder, gentler form of manipulation.
Maybe. The thing is, the generous ZD player still maintains an advantage. They just share a little more of the wealth with their opponent.
It's almost like they're trying to strike a balance, get what they want but not be a total jerk about it.
Exactly. And the article suggests that these generous ZD strategies might be a way to reconcile self-interest with a degree of cooperation.
That's actually a pretty hopeful thought. So even in the midst of all this strategic maneuvering, there might be a path towards finding common ground.
That's what the research seems to suggest. It's like the prisoner's dilemma keeps surprising us. Just when we think we've figured it out, it throws us a curveball.
I know. It's like a never-ending source of fascination. Well, I think our listeners' brains are probably as full of ours right now.
Definitely. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the basic prisoner's dilemma, looked at different strategies, seen how it plays out in groups, and even how it connects to evolution.
And we even got a taste of the mind-bending world of zero-determinant strategies.
It's been a real deep dive, but I think the key takeaway for our philosopher listener is this. The prisoner's dilemma, it's more than just a game.
It's like a lens for understanding ourselves, our relationships, and even how we structure society.
Exactly. It highlights the tension between self-interest and the common good, the fragility of trust, the power of incentives, and it challenges us to find creative ways to overcome those challenges.
To build systems that encourage cooperation, even when it feels like everyone's out for themselves.
So the next time you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose between what's good for you and what's good for the group.
Remember the prisoner's dilemma.
Exactly. Think about the potential consequences of your actions, not just for you, but for everyone involved. And consider the possibility that cooperation, even when it feels risky, might actually be the best path forward.
It might just lead to a better outcome for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the prisoner's dilemma. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep searching for those win-win solutions that make cooperation not just a possibility, but a reality.